Hello, thank you so much for being here. My name is Jared Brickman, and I have the absolute pleasure today to talk to you about brand research as part of Carnegie's ongoing series, The Power of Personality, Building a Higher Education Brand That Connects. A little bit about me. This is my eighth year at Carnegie. I am our SVP of Research. Did my doctoral work at Washington State University and really focused a lot of that time on the question of how do we send the right messages to the right people to actually get them to change their behaviors and perceptions. And that's why I get really excited to talk about this whole kind of core idea that we've been reviewing through our webinar series of personality science and why it's at the heart of really, I think, all good communication. But for the purposes of what we'll talk about today, institutional brand. Now, in the first part of our webinar series, you got to hear from Tyler Borders talking about what personality science is, getting into the depth of why it matters. But for today's purposes, I just want to reiterate that personality science really is the way that we think about how to craft a great story. Because to us, storytelling is what creates human connection. It's the thing that engages not just our logical brain, but our emotional brain. And there's a tremendous amount of power to that. As I mentioned, I spend a lot of time thinking about how do we get people to actually change their minds? How do we use communication in a really functional way? And while a lot of people tend to believe that their decisions are grounded in logic, there's a lot more emotion to that process than we think. Even when we are building a really important decision, like let's say the college you're going to attend, it's easy to believe that all we do is we do some sort of mental calculus and we add up, oh, well, this one has the better major, that one is a little closer, there's cost. Of course, that happens. But intermixed with that process is perceptual bias. And the perceptual bias is often created by the way they feel about your institution. The emotional side of that decision making is going to make them go, well, that program's a little bit better, but I kind of really like that faculty member I talked to at the other institution. So there is going to be an emotional side to that decision making that's really important to how we create our communication. And again, storytelling tends to be the greatest driver of that because that is how we have been communicating for the longest as a species. We've been telling stories, and that helps put our mind into really the world of what's going on with that institution. This means that the essential question that you need to ask yourself when you're thinking about institutional brand is a question that relates to good storytelling. And that is, what is the protagonist of my story? Who is that protagonist? Who are you as an institution? It's a big question. And unfortunately, big questions like this can struggle in the minds of people that you work with and yourself because it's really hard to just verbalize who you are from a personality standpoint. Oftentimes, when someone asks you who you are, you default to things like your education, your occupation, maybe your family. And those are great pieces of information, but it's not about who you are, what motivates and drives you. And that's what we want to think about with your institutional brand. We should understand not what you are, but who you are and why that kind of personality exists. That's how we build in the personality science piece to your brand expression. Now, at Carnegie, we use a platform called archetypes. You can actually see the 9 archetypes that we use in our work in kind of this circle here. The 9 different archetypes are color coded for easy heuristic remembering. But the base idea that I want to tell you is that it doesn't matter if it's archetypes. It could be Big Five, it could be the Enneagram, it could be any other personality-based model. Regardless of that, you need to have a foundational model for understanding who you are. Because otherwise, that big question becomes too big. It becomes too messy. But if you have a system like the archetypes, it is going to help you organize an understanding of who you are in such a way that not only will you be able to kind of evangelize that to other people, those people will also be able to create amazing content through the lens of your personality because you have a really well established system. It's not just 10 words on a page of pillars, but really an understanding of who you are at that base motivational level. The question then becomes, though, okay, we've got 9 archetypes in your system, or there's numbers in Enneagram, whatever it might be. Well, how do we actually know who we are in this system? It's great that you have a system, but we kind of have to know, well, what part of that really resonates authentically with our institution today and with where we want our institution to be in the future. So that's why I want to talk about brand research today, because it is how you gather good data and information to help you make that decision of knowing who you are as an institution to set up that really successful brand. When I think of brand research, I think of 3 key areas that are going to come together to create the best possible amount of data and information to inform a brand position. The first being your internal audiences. What do your internal audiences believe of your institution today, on its best day, on its worst day, as well as its ideal future? Where do your internal audiences want to see your institution in the future? Now, it's really important to note that why we look at internal audiences being so important is that they just happen to know you the best. If I was going to try and figure out what my personality was as an individual, I would probably go and talk to the people that interact with me the most. That would be my spouse. That would be my friends, my coworkers. They probably have a bit more of an understanding of who I am than people who have only kind of come in contact with me a few times. Now, you all, as more external audiences to who I am, a person who hasn't necessarily had a deep discussion with you in the past, you would be more like an external audience. And what I am doing today, how I'm presenting myself in this webinar, is going to build your perception of my brand, my personal brand, who I am. And it's the same on the institutional side. So once we understand what your internal audiences believe, we also need to talk to external audiences. In the world of institutional brand for higher education, that's your prospective students, parents of prospective students, uh, college counselors, independent educational counselors, teachers in the secondary space, maybe teachers and professors, staff at other colleges and universities, as well as community leaders, politicians who are making changes to things going on in education. These are all external audiences that have a view and a vision of your institution. And doing really good research to understand what that view and vision of you is today will help you better position where you can be tomorrow. Because you will find out what are the things they really like about you. What are the things you really aren't doing well according to those audiences. And I like to tell people external perceptions don't always have to ring true to you. They just have to ring true to your audience. And so there are going to be some surprises. There are going to be some differences between what the internal audience believes and knows about you and what that external audience is actually seeing. So knowing where you are today in your external audiences allows you to better prepare for how you communicate with them tomorrow. And we'll talk a little bit about encoding and decoding of communication messages with your audiences in just a bit. But those are your first 2 pieces. The third pivotal and critical piece of brand research you should be doing is understanding your competition. What are other institutions like yours expressing about their brand? What are the things that they're saying that make them unique or distinct? What are the different pieces of their brand that really are kind of resonating out in the market? Understanding where the rest of your competitors lay allow you to understand, well, which messages do we have to compete on? This is something that we also believe, so we have to be better at this. Which are the messages that will make you truly unique and distinct? None of our competitors are talking about this piece of thing through this lens. Here's how we stand out. And it's also just good to know what other institutions are doing. I think we always get a little bit insular, and being able to see what's out there can be really helpful in our own ideation of what a brand can be and how it can make people feel. So you might ask, okay, we have these elements. We've got the internal, the external, the competition. How do we actually go about gathering data and information? And so these are some of the key methodologies I might recommend for institutional research. I don't want to turn this into a methods course. You probably all took your college research methods course in the past, and you're probably pretty well aware of each of these. But what I want to talk about is how this fits into the larger idea of brand research and how you can use these different methodologies really successfully. The first being consensus building. And I tend to think of consensus building not so much as like kind of a traditional metric or measure in a methodology sense, but it's a kind of a purposeful event. It's something where you bring people together and you have them disagree with one another and discuss until they can come away with some solution that a lot of people like. This can be sometimes the first step, sometimes it's the last step of brand research, but it is definitely getting this to this space where lots of voices are being heard and they're having that interactive kind of ability to work it out together. Consensus building tends to be more of a qualitative approach that is likened to my second bullet point here, interviews and focus groups, which are kind of the crux of traditional qualitative research gathering. Interviews, of course, being those one-on-one situations. And I love interviews, especially for institutional leadership and those folks who really have a strong voice and a strong opinion in the matter. If you have your institution's president being part of this brand work, that should be an interview. You can include them in consensus building, of course, and focus groups and other pieces of research. But if you don't do that one-on-one interview with your most important stakeholders, there's a miss there. Focus groups, a little bit more traditional of bringing in groups of folks, maybe 8 to 12, talking about discussing and disagreeing on several areas. The difference between consensus building and focus groups, though, is that consensus building is trying to get to an end point. A focus group is really just about asking good questions and getting good feedback. It helps create those thematic and in-depth ideas that make qualitative research so valuable. Next, there's surveys and experiments. This is how you get your quantitative information. I know there will be at least one person at the room every time you do brand research, every time you try to roll out brand, and they're going to want a number. They're that person who says, well, did our brand get better? What's the number? And you won't really have that unless you do some quantitative based research. I love quantitative research and surveys, especially for external audiences, because that's going to be a thing that you're going to be able to track over time really well. And you also don't have the bias of where internal audiences might get a little bit, oh, that's too much of a survey. That's too much of a way to do this in a quantified way. Surveys, really great way to gather that data that's going to be numerical. Of course, you can also collect qualitative information in a survey, but I tend to find its greatest power is in that quantitative side. What's really important to remember about good surveys, though, and why it is so critical to have that foundation of some sort of personality system, is that in order to get quantitative numbers, you have to have quantitative measures. You have to be able to ask, well, we know at least X amount to be able to ask about a person's kind of perceptions or thoughts of something. If it's completely open-ended, you've again lost your opportunity to gather quantitative data. Highly related to surveys, of course, are experiments. This is where you're going to have multiple condition groups. They might see different things, and then we see how they react to them differently. Always a great way to understand kind of brand response as well. One group sees brand A, one group sees brand B. How is it that they respond to that? Then there's content analysis. This is the systematic review of content in some sort of space. And this is really helpful in your competitive research space. So if you want to understand what competitors are doing, you probably want to comb through their websites and their view books and their highest kind of brand-based pieces of communication to understand what they're doing. And finally, there's secondary data synthesis. This is taking things from sources like the Census Bureau, Bureau of Labor Statistics, the NCES. All that data that's out there and available is really good for understanding nationwide trends and understanding where things might be in the industry as a whole. Using these methodologies, of course, you can now gather a great deal of good information. And it's important that you think about intermixing multiple methodologies. Having a mixed method approach to research is really powerful because the things that you miss in a survey might come up in an interview. The depth and questions that you might get in a focus group could be covered in content analysis you're doing about your current brand materials. Whatever it might be, the more methodologies you bring into this system, within reason, is going to give you different kinds of information and cover the weak spots of each methodology, because there is no one perfect methodology. If there was, that's the only method researchers would always use, but there isn't. So we need to figure out what's the best mix of methodologies. And the final thing I'll mention about this is because you're bringing in all of this data and information, it's really easy to say, okay, I'm done with my brand research. Now I have my brand. And that's just not true. The numbers cannot tell you exactly what your brand should be. 1,000 quotes won't tell you exactly what your brand should be. You require analysis, synthesis, and really important, a final strategic look at all of this information to make a good decision. Research cannot answer all of your questions. What it can do is give you good data to make good decisions. And that's what I want you to think about when you do your brand research, that this isn't going to just say, okay, there's only one possible solution. It's going to say, here are the things you should consider when you are making these really smart strategic decisions. But ultimately, we have to do that piece. And actually, the great thing is that in next video in our webinar with David Vigiano, he is going to talk about how you take that data and turn it into that strategy. So I'm always really excited to kind of see that next step in the process. So you have this information about who you are as an institution. You might now ask, well, how do I know what to say? So we kind of need to see the other side of the equation. I mentioned earlier I was going to bring in the basic communication model. I have to. It's a throwback to Com 101. But I think it's always really important to remember some of the kind of nuances of this model that are really important when we're thinking about where our brand ends up having an impact, because it's really everywhere. Your brand is who you are as the sender. It's also going to influence how you encode your messages. It's really going to say, okay, this is the lens through which we want to talk about our institution. So then you have your message. It goes through some channel. It could be an email. It could be your view book. It could be a social media post, whatever it might be. And then your receiver is going to have to decode that message. Now, it's really easy to believe that decoding is just the process of, oh, did they understand my email? Do they know what financial aid means now? That's one side of decoding, but really the important part of decoding is understanding that the receiver also has a personality. Their personality science is important to how they decode your message, how they receive your message. And so for us, that is why we have taken our kind of understanding of brand and said you also need to apply it to your audiences. One of the really cool things about basing your brand or your institutional brand on human personality, on personality science, is that now you can actually directly connect that to the personality science and psychographics of audiences. Let me show you what I mean by that. Let's say we have an institution that works with us and they have a couple really specific archetypes that they believe are authentic and true to their story. The green adventurer, the blue leader, these are really strong archetypes for their institution. And they know one of the student groups that they attract a lot, and one of those student groups that's really pivotal to their enrollment and who they are as a brand, those students are really attracted to blue and purple institutions. Well, seems pretty obvious. If I'm going to send a message about my college or university to this group of students, I should be sending it through the lens of the blue archetype. This is not telling me what to say. What to say could be based on a lot of other different things, like do they need financial aid? What major are they going into? But critically, it is helping you understand how to say it. because that is what's going to differentiate you. That is what's going to make the difference in the way that people are understanding your institution. When you think about doing research about your different audiences, there are some other methodologies I might recommend you employ. Now, of course, there's still surveys, there's still interviews, focus groups, all the things you do in internal brand research can also go about doing for audience-based brand research. But there are some other methodologies that I think you could also consider or things that you should be thinking about. One of which is ethnography. This is understanding the culture of a group, typically through observation and through an understanding of what they're doing. Ethnography, I often think of like Jane Goodall and the Chimps. That's like understanding group dynamics by observing a group and what they do. Very similarly to that, or potentially a type of ethnography, is participant observation. This is where you actually go and you do the things with the people. I'm not necessarily recommending that you and your staff go out and go to frat parties with your student audiences. But what I do think is important about participant observation is the idea of including current students in creating profiles, in creating an understanding of who your audiences are. If you want a participant, we should get that information from the really the source. So I always think about making sure that you have that student element when you are trying to create a student audience persona or segment. This is very similar if you had a parent segment or any other. We want to get input from those groups, the people that know those groups the best. There's also social network analysis. This is a really cool methodology that looks at the ways that people interact and connect in online spaces, which online spaces are really interconnected, which groups are talking to each other a lot. Social network analysis is a great way to understand channel as well, if you think back to that communication model. There's also models of positive deviance. I love positive deviance. It's actually a great way to understand data analysis. And so when you have information about a particular audience, you might have a goal or outcome. And what positive deviance explains, or it's kind of the approach, is that you might have a person that does the positive outcome. Let's say it's enrolling in your college. They enrolled in your college, even though everything up to that point kind of says, oh, they're not going to come. They had a bad tour. They thought you were too expensive. They didn't like your majors. They don't love the people. They don't love the institution. And yet they enrolled. Okay. So why did they enroll and what makes them different? And how can we understand that process to use their kind of information to capture more audiences like that? It's also really great in retention strategies, but that's not what we're here to talk about. We're talking about brand. I just want to mention that this is another way to understand your audiences really well and the decisions they're making so that you can form these types of profiles. So you have your institutional brand, you have what is really attractive to different student segments. Now it's about figuring out how to connect those up. And that is a whole extra process. Again, there's going to be more work throughout our webinar series. In brand research, I just wanted to talk about how do you get there? How do you set that foundation of knowledge? And I wanted to end on a last little concept that really speaks to why this matters so much, why your brand consistency matters, and why good research about your brand consistency matters. And that is going to come from the world of neuroscience and the idea of schema theory. Schemas are the way that we align information within our brain. It's very similar. It sounds like schematic, right? The schematic of a building. Well, a schema in our brain is how different concepts are structured, connect, and really interact. This is one just random basic schema that I put together for example's sake. But if I say the word colleges, and you hear me say the word colleges, there are going to be things that instantly light up in your mind. There are other topics and concepts that are closer in relationship to the term colleges than other things. So here, campus, education, I might think a pathway to jobs. These are all things I might associate with college. And so now, if I shifted the conversation from just saying the word college to instead I said the name of your institution, What do you hope happens with that schema? Because this is what often happens. I say X institution, X university, and the schema changes a little bit. Maybe now they have the location of the institution. They might say, oh, that major is a major I really like, or they have specific degrees. But if I go back for one slide to this slide, the changes aren't that distinct. They're pretty similar. Like these two schemas, you can't really tell the difference. And this is the problem that almost every higher education brand has when they are talking to their audiences, especially prospective students. Their schema between what is college and what is your institution is almost exactly the same. Now, that's not necessarily a terrible thing. We do want them to know what your institution is. But what's unfortunate is now when they talk about another college, it's going to be almost exactly the same, and another, and another. Brand is the way that you create that differentiation, and importantly, consistent brand over time. Because the only way that schemas really change is experiences and consistent experiences with that topic or term. So if they're having consistent communication from you, consistent experiences with your institution, and you are very consistent in the way that you send your messages, the possibility, the thing that we're going for, is a schema that looks more like this. Yes, campus is still there. My major is still there. Degrees are still there. Maybe positioning have changed, but look at what are some of the other things that have jumped into the equation. A term like success, nowhere to be seen here. These are all beige, regular, uninteresting things. They are the what. But the why and the who suddenly jumps into their schema. They start to associate your brand with community, with having lifelong friends, being successful and winning. These are color coded to the archetypes in the Carnegie system, but you can kind of see where I'm going. These aren't just terms that are kind of basic descriptors, they are personality terms. This is the personality science. And now, when they think about your institution, these are the things that light up instead of their basic schema like this. And that's so powerful because they will remember that. That will be what creates that emotional pull and tug toward their decision making. And they are going to come away with a lot better experience across all of the different things that you're trying to communicate with them if they feel this consistent through line. If you are always a strong blue archetype, they are going to feel that. It does take time and it takes repeated exposure. That's why schemas are hard to break. That's why it's difficult for us to break from our base biases in life. But when your institution's schema can start to look very different from the basic college schema, you are going to have more success. And that is what really indicates that your brand has taken hold. And so when we do brand-based research, one of the other things you can do with your audiences is do some questions that are based in schemas. It can be as simple as what's the first word that comes to mind about your institution? And the first time you do this, if your brand hasn't been consistent, it's all going to be terms like these. But if you've been consistent and your brand has been successful, our research has found you start to see more of these really personality and archetype driven really outcomes in your brand research. And that means it's sticking. That means people are going to remember you. And that's why it's so powerful. And it's how you then create that connection through storytelling. Schemas are one of the end results of good storytelling. Developed and distinctive schemas are the pinnacle of the outcome of storytelling. I really appreciate your time here today. If you have any questions for me, this is my email address. You can always get in touch to talk about the research method, what it is when we talk about brand research here at Carnegie. But also, if you just want to drop me a note and talk about this webinar, I am available to you. Also, as I mentioned before, we have several other webinars in this series, the next one being with David Vigiano to talk about how we take this brand research and data and turn it into a brand strategy. So I appreciate your time here today and good luck. I know that brand can feel very intimidating, but it is something that I think is really interesting to most folks. Have a good one.